Hi and welcome to this video where I show you how I color the vegetable page in Morgentau or Twilight Garden by Maria Trolle. Since there's no background in this illustration, I show you how I create a spring-themed background. If you're new to this channel, hi, my name is Ina. If not, welcome back. I've picked out some watercolor pencils from Castle Arts. And as always, if you don't have the exact art supplies I use, just use similar pencils you own. Otherwise, you can find the colors listed by object in the info box below the video. I'm coloring this page for the hashtag Color the Fairy Tales by Geordie Colors for the fairy tale The Enormous Turnip. Even though the harvest season isn't in spring, I wanted to use a spring color palette and create a kind of paint splatter effect so that it looks as if there are different color splashes everywhere. I'll start with Jaipur pink and begin coloring around the areas that will later have a similar shade, like this radish here. For the second radish, I do the same, just a bit more unevenly. I'll probably use this color again later, but for now I'm switching to cadmium red to color around the turnip and also a bit around the second one. I leave some spaces free so it doesn't look completely outlined. Next, I take cadmium orange middle to color the areas around the carrot. Again, I leave some spots free. I also color slightly over the other shade so that later, when I activate the watercolor pencils, the colors will blend nicely. So, these flowers are marigolds, which range from yellow to orange. I think I'll make these ones yellow here, because I already have orange from the carrot here. Then I'll make these ones over here a bit orange, just to spread the colors out so the same color isn't right next to itself. Now I'm using brilliant yellow, a yellow-orange in-between shade, and I'm blending it here with a pink a bit. I go around the carrot a little and around the second one too, and a bit around the lower flower. Here I'll add a little more of the orange. Then I'm using lemon yellow, simply so that not everything is the same yellow. I'll add a bit more of that yellow here too. Now I'm using leaf green light and adding some color around the leaves, all around the flower and around the broad beans. I just noticed there's another flower here. I'll make that one a bit more orange-yellow later, so I will add some orange and yellow here as well. Then I continue with the greens. And now I'm using Castle Green Light as the second green. I'm filling in a few gaps here, but I try not to bring this green directly next to the pink, because when I activate the watercolor pencils later, it would turn into a brown or look dirty. Now I look where the color still fits, always trying to create irregular shapes. I add a bit more down here. And now I see how I can fill the other gaps so the colors work well together. I add a little yellow in the center and a bit more at the top. A bit more at the bottom and some yellow between the beans. Now I take the darker yellow again and fill in a few more gaps. And also added a little orange yellow along the edges in a few spots. Then I take the darker orange again and add a bit more here as well. And so that a bit of that pink pops up around the edges as well, I'm adding just a tiny bit here. This will all be activated and blended shortly. Now I'm using my water tank brush and just starting somewhere. Ideally, you would start at the top, but I want to work a bit from the inside out. I also have a cloth here, in case I get too much pigment on the brush, so I can dab it off a little. I'm also trying to dab the color transitions, so I don't get any hard edges. But activating the color works better at first with small circular motions. From time to time, I check on the back of my hand to feel how wet the brush still is. I definitely notice that where I only colored with streaky lines, it's not blending as well. So I'm going over this pink shade again a bit. Maybe I pressed a little too hard there. Right here at the edges, I'm still dabbing in a little color to get more of that paint splatter effect and to make the transition to the white of the paper look a bit more interesting. Now I'm continuing in the center. To make it easier, I turn the book around And I can already see that these scribbles at the edges don't dissolve as well. I should have colored a bit more evenly and with less pressure there. Now I just take the pencil again and pick up a bit of color here. And I try to dab to cover some of the streaks from coloring. I also want to make the color a bit more vibrant. I do the same again with all the other colors. So I'm quite satisfied now. I probably should have done this earlier, but I'm clipping the corners here in the hope that the page will dry a bit flatter, even though it's mostly dry already. But I just let it dry completely for now. I definitely think the colors already look very spring-like. And when all the vegetables and flowers are fully colored in with bright tones, I imagine it will look good. So it's dry now, but I'm leaving the clips on the page anyway, just to keep the page a bit flatter. I'm starting with a carrot and using a brown shade, simply to indicate a bit of soil in these little furrows. Alright, that was sepia. Now I'm using orange lake and coloring the edge of the carrot with it, getting lighter toward the center to create the effect that it really looks round. I press a bit more at the edges and lighten my pressure toward the center, so I can get a better transition. Now I use cadmium orange, a slightly lighter orange, and work my way towards the center. The lightest color I use is Marigold. Next, I continue with Prussian green on the carrot leaves. Here, I find it a bit tricky to see where one leaf actually ends and the next one begins, because the leaves are so curly. Now I'm using permanent green, and I think in the end it won't really matter if you just add a bit of dark green here and then transition into a lighter green. In the end, no one will question whether the little parts really belong to one leaf or another. And now I'm using leaf green middle and filling in the rest of the leaves. The first carrot is finished. And now I'll do this one too. So the carrot is done. Now I'm moving on to the radish. I start with spice red and again make it darker along the edges. Then I use cadmium red. Down here, near the white area, I'll already make the edges a bit lighter. Then I use scarlet red. And now I make some dots or short strokes here because the transition to the white is relatively harsh. It's not a soft transition like with the different red tones, but sometimes there are these small, well, irregularities. As the lightest red tone, I use Venetian red. Then I use warm gray light and shade the white area here. And finally I use titanium white for the rest of the lower part. Here for the leaves I start with Hooker's green, and otherwise I use the same colors as for the carrot. This leaf vein here will be light green, and because these leaves aren't as frayed as the carrot leaves, it's much easier here to see which leaf is which. Now it's back to Prussian green, then comes permanent green, and finally leaf green middle, which I also use for the leaf vein. Alright, then I'll continue with the turnip. I hope you can see it good enough. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about the sun rays right now. But it's also nice that the sun is shining more often again. So I start with cobalt purple. Turnips come in various colors, and I've decided on a purple and white one, meaning it basically looks similar to a radish, just a bit more purple. I use the color purple next, then purple light. With that I color a light layer in the middle, and then I use lavender light. Again I use warm gray light for the shadow area of the lighter part. But here it doesn't transition into white. Instead it goes into Naples yellow light, because it looks slightly yellowish in my reference photo. And only then I use titanium white. For the leaves, this time I'm using Castle Green Deep, a slightly bluish green, to bring in a bit of a different tone. The leaf veins here are a bit different, but you can still easily distinguish the leaves from each other, which makes coloring a bit easier. Next I continue with Castle Green, then Castle Green Light, and for the lightest tone I again use leaf green middle. Now I move on to the beans, and I start with the inside of the bean. For that I use Mellow Sage from the Castle Arts Harmonious set. I have to say, I love that I can often find colors in the Harmonious set that aren't in my big set, and I can always combine them well. Of course, it would be practical if all the colors were in one set, but this still works too. Now I'm using pale apple. There isn't a big difference between the colors. but the center is now a bit lighter than the edges. And I can already continue with the individual beans, and I'm also coloring the entire bean here at the same time. For that, I'm using Prussian green again. Then I switch back to permanent green. Now for the small beans, just like for the whole pot, I used the tiny markings for the shadow areas. Next, I continue with leaf green middle. This is a color I haven't used yet, namely leaf green light. In the same way, I now quickly color all the other broad beans. And in between, I even had some support. Okay, let's continue with the onion here. And I start with raw umber. I could have colored a red onion here, but I thought then I would have too much of that color on this side and nothing on the other. So I decided on a classic white onion with a slightly brownish skin. Now I'm continuing with cinnamon. Next, I use terracotta light. And here I very lightly color the middle area with terracotta light. And then I go over it with a light yellow and white. The roots also get just a tiny bit of color at first. Next, I use lemon yellow light, but only lightly and without too much pressure. After that, I use titanium white to make the middle area a bit brighter and to blend the colored pencils. I also color the roots with white now. So, here's a small section left. I make the lower area slightly yellow, and on this side as well. And now I use leaf green middle to go over the rest. And then I go over it with white again to make it a bit brighter. Next, I continue with the leaves, starting with Hooker's green and simply using some of the pre-drawn shadows again. This leaf now looks as if it's coming out of nowhere. So I'll darken this part that I saw as background to make sure the leaf doesn't just appear from nothing. Now I'm using Prussian green, and then I continue with permanent green. For the brightest areas, I use leaf green middle. Now only the marigolds are left. As I mentioned at the beginning, they came in yellow and orange, and all the shades in between. So I'll try to add a little variety and color the blossoms in different tones. I'll start with these here, and now I'm beginning with Castle Green Deep. This is definitely an interesting way to draw the leaves. I'm not really sure how to shade them, but I'll just go for it. I'm not coloring the stem very neatly here, because I'll go over it with the other greens later. Next, I use Castle Green for the transition to the next color, which is Castle Green Light. Compared to the two other greens, it's a bit more yellowish. And with this, I'll fill in the gaps of the flower's stem. The highlight green is Leaf Green Light. Now I'm using red ochre, starting at the outer edges of the petals and getting a bit lighter towards the inside. Since this blossom and the one next to it hang from the same stem, their color will end up the same. Next, I use Orange Lake. The other flowers will get some variety in color, though I also try to add a slightly variation here later. Then comes Cadmium Orange, and in the center I use Marigold. Now, for demonstration purposes, I'm doing this blossom, starting with Cadmium Orange. Here too, the tips of the petals are darker than the inside. Next, I use Marigold. Then comes Cadmium Yellow Deep, and in the center I use Golden Yellow Deep. For the very inside of the blossom, I use Chinese Orange, and then I go over it again with Golden Yellow Deep. For this blossom here, I start with Marigold, which means it will look similar but have a little less orange than the previous blossoms. Now again, Cadmium Orange Deep, then Golden Yellow, and finally Cadmium Yellow Light. Alright, now I quickly finish the green areas and the other flowers, and then you'll see the final result. So, I'd say the page is finished. I think this page doesn't need any embellishments. Here you can see it again as a whole. I think it turned into a lovely spring page with a very colorful background. But I think it suits spring well in terms of color. After all those winter pages, this was a nice change. Okay, That was the page with the vegetables in Morgentau or Twilight Garden by Maria Trolle. I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye and see you next time.